Okay, a couple different things that we're going to do today. First of all, I'm going to very quickly review what we talked about yesterday with federalism, and then we're going to talk about some new stuff today about how Congress uses money to get states to do what Congress wants. If they can't pass a law themselves, they can a lot of times use money to get states to do what they can't do themselves. But first of all, we're going to review what we talked about yesterday. First of all, three types of government in the world. Most governments are unitary, meaning the national government can always tell the states or cities or regions or provinces what to do. The opposite of that is a confederation, which is something like the UN or the European Union, where countries get together and they form something bigger. And the ultimate power, though, is still with the smaller countries. What we do is federal, which means sometimes the national government makes the final call, sometimes the smaller government makes the final call. Different types of powers. If you want to know in our system which government gets to do something, national or state, you look to the Constitution. And an expressed power or an enumerated power is one that is specifically written down in the Constitution. There's no arguing about it. It's easy. And almost all of the expressed or enumerated powers in the Constitution are with the national government. An implied power is something that's not quite written down exactly, but it's really close to something that is. So as we talked about yesterday, the Constitution doesn't mention an Air Force, but that's very close to an Army and a Navy. And Congress does have the express power to maintain an Army and a Navy. So they have an implied power to establish and maintain an Air Force. And that's because of the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause, which basically says Congress has implied powers. If the Constitution is silent completely about a power, like education or a drinking age or something like that, that means states get to do it, and the 10th Amendment makes that clear. If the Constitution is silent, the power goes to the states, not the national government. And we talked yesterday about the three provisions that come up over and over again when Congress wants to do something and it's not clear if they can or not. One is the Commerce Clause. The courts have allowed Congress to construe interstate commerce very broadly, to include not just traditional business, but also things like people going back and forth, radio waves going back and forth. And it's also allowed Congress to say that they can regulate anything that might have an effect on interstate commerce, even if it doesn't go back and forth itself. So if you think about the wheat in the Wickard case, or the hotels and the restaurants in the Heart of Atlanta case, Congress sort of gave, or the court sort of gave Congress the benefit of the doubt and says, okay, that sort of relates to interstate commerce, so Congress, you can make a law about it. And if you do, then the states can't undercut it. The elastic clause we talked about yesterday, it's all the implied powers. And the McCulloch versus Maryland case said basically if Congress is close as far as implied powers, we, the courts, are going to give Congress the benefit of the doubts, and Congress is going to win and the states are going to lose. And then the 10th Amendment, which we already talked about, reserved powers go to states. And then the Supremacy Clause says if the national and state come into conflict, as long as the national government is doing something it's allowed to do, the national is going to win. The state can't do anything to undercut it, like tax the national government or anything like that, and that's called the Supremacy Clause. And then these are the cases that we looked at yesterday, a couple of the bigger ones. McCulloch versus Maryland is the one that will be on the AP exam. Congress established a national bank, and when they did, Maryland taxed it. The Supreme Court said that Congress had the implied power to create a national bank, and that Congress has a lot of implied powers, which is why it's important for the future. It set the precedent that Congress has a lot of implied powers, and also that Maryland, under the Supremacy Clause, can't tax the bank out of existence. Then Gibbons v. Ogden, which set the principle that the court was going to give Congress a lot of leeway as far as interstate commerce, as far as what that means and what Congress can make laws about. An example of that was Heart of Atlanta Motel, where the court upheld the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed by Congress, which prohibited motels and restaurants from discriminating by race. And then the time when the court stood up to Congress in 1995, and this is one of the AP cases, U.S. v. Lopez, Congress passed a law saying you can't bring a gun to school. The Supreme Court struck it down and said, no, that's something for states to handle, not Congress. So that's what we did yesterday. What we're going to look at now is the general welfare or tax and spend clause, which says basically Congress can spend money on anything. And we're going to look at how Congress has used this clause used money basically to get states to do things that Congress can't do by itself. So this is called fiscal federalism, and what we're going to look at is how the national government has used the tax and spend general welfare clause to gain power over states. And Ms. Bug, what I'm going to do now is every time I put up a screen, what I want you to do, Ms. Bug, is pause the video, let them write down everything on the screen, and then once everybody has written everything down, then I'll go back and sort of talk it through. So go ahead and pause the video now. Okay, so we're going to look at how the government has used, the national government has used the spending clause to gain power over states. And go ahead and pause the video and let them write this. Okay, up until the 1930s, the federal and state governments did separate things and they left each other alone. The national government did its thing, and mostly it had to do with the military and foreign policy. And then states did everything else: education, transportation, healthcare, local crime. And the two governments didn't mix very much. And so what that's referred to is dual federalism, or sometimes it's called layer cake federalism. So if you can imagine a layer cake with two different layers on top of each other, the one on top is the national with military and foreign, the one on the bottom is states with education, transportation. And they don't mix it all. It's just one big cake, but there's no mixing between the two. So they call that dual federalism or layer cake federalism. And if you use the term layer cake federalism to describe that on the AP exam, that's fine. Okay, go ahead and pause. Okay, since the 30s, when FDR came in the 30s, he did the New Deal and he made the federal government a lot more active. And the federal government started to get involved in more things, and so the states and the national government started working on things together in a way that they had not previously. And this is called cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism. So if you can imagine a marble cake, which is like a swirl cake with the different colors together. So instead of two separate layers, it's one big cake with everything mixed in together. So a good example of that is the Medicaid program. We talked about Medicare, which is government health care for older people. Medicaid is government health insurance for poor people. And the way that works is the states run the program day by day. They enroll people. They decide what types of health care is covered. They decide who's eligible. They make all the day-to-day decisions. But then at the end of the year, the state governments then send a bill to the national government, and the national government pays for it. So it's kind of a joint state-federal program where they both play a role. The state government plays a role in running it. The federal government pays for it. And so that's a good example of cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism, which is more how the government works today. It's more how the national and states relate to each other today. Go ahead and pause. Okay, so the way that Congress can get states to do what Congress wants them to do is through money. Congress can, under the tax and spend clause or general welfare clause, spend money on anything. So for example, what Congress did back in the 80s is Congress said to the states, we don't have the power to raise the drinking age, but you states do. So if you raise the drinking age to 21 from 18, which is what we want you to do, we, Congress, will give you states money for your highways. And every state did it, took the money, raised the drinking age. South Dakota put up a little bit of a fight. They said, no, we want the highway money, but we don't want to have to raise the drinking age. Congress can't do this to us. They can't put us in this position. And the Supreme Court sided with the national government. Dole was the National Secretary of Transportation, which is why it's called South Dakota v. Dole, but basically it's South Dakota v. U.S., and U.S. won. The Supreme Court made it clear that the national government does not have to give money to states at all. And so when they do, they can do it with conditions. And so money going from the national government to a state is called a grant or a grant and aid. And money and the strings that come with that, in order to get the money, the states have to do these things. Those strings are called conditions or conditions and aid. So in South Dakota versus Dole, the grant was the money for the highways. The condition was raising the drinking age. Go ahead and pause. Okay, a mandate is something different. It is an order from the national government to the states to do this. Not if you want the money, you have to do this, but basically you have to do this. If you think about something being mandatory, that means you have to do it. And so a mandate is an order that the federal government gives to states saying you have to do this. So for example, in the 60s, the Supreme Court said to all of the states in Miranda v. Arizona that you have to read suspects their rights at the time of arrest, and if you don't, you can't use the confession at trial. It's a rule states had to follow, like it or not. It didn't have anything to do with money. So a mandate is an order. Do this. You have to. No choice in the matter. You have to do it. That's what a mandate is. Go ahead and pause. Okay, this is how Congress and the states relate to each other through money. Up top, you've got revenue sharing. And revenue sharing would be if Congress were to say to Virginia, here's $10 million. You, Virginia, know what you need more than we do. You can do whatever you want with it. Here's the money. Improve your state. Pretty good deal for the states. A block grant would be, here's money for a certain area. Here's money for education or transportation. And you decide what to do with it, but you've got to use it in that area. So a block grant for education would mean Virginia gets the money. They've got to spend it on education, but Virginia can decide exactly how. So Virginia can build new schools. Virginia can raise teacher salaries. They can buy computers for students. As long as it's education related, then Virginia can use that block grant from Congress. A categorical grant is when Congress gives states money to do something very specific. So if Congress were to say to Virginia, here's some money that you have to use to build a road, a new bridge between Virginia Beach and Hampton, then that's a categorical grant. If you want the money, here's exactly what you have to do with it. And then an unfunded mandate, an unfunded order, is what states like the least, because Congress is telling them, here's what you have to do, and you have to pay for it. We're not giving you any money. So you have to build this road, and you have to pay for it. So if you think about it like your parents, if Hallie Spade's parents were to say, Hallie, we're so proud of you for graduating from Cape Henry. Here's a $500,000 check. Do whatever you want with it. Pay for college, start a business, go to Europe and travel, throw a party. Then you do whatever you want with the money. You've earned it. Have fun. That's revenue sharing. Hallie's going to like that a lot. A block grant would be, Hallie, we're going to pay for you to go to college. You choose the school. Any college is fine, but we will pay for you to go to college. Pretty good. A categorical grant would be, Hallie, we will pay for you to go to Virginia Tech, but we will not pay for you to go to college anywhere else. And then an unfunded mandate would be, Hallie, you're going to go to college and you're going to pay for it. So Hallie's not going to like that much. So revenue sharing gives states the most flexibility. An unfunded mandate gives states no flexibility at all. And really the most common is the block grant. What Congress is most likely to do is say to a state, we want you to spend some money in this area, but you choose the details, the particulars. Pause. Okay, some examples of some unfunded mandates. The Clean Air Act. Congress passed a law that said basically states have to reduce pollution. And they put pollution standards on states, and reducing pollution costs money, and states had to pay for that. And so then the question is, well, why can Congress do that? Well, that goes back to what we talked about yesterday. Congress can pass the Clean Air Act and require states to pay to clean up pollution because of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Because pollution travels from state to state, that's interstate commerce, and Congress gets to make a rule about it. If a coal mine in West Virginia is polluting and the wind blows that pollution into to Tennessee, then that's interstate commerce. Congress can make a rule and tell states they've got to clean it up. Americans with Disabilities Act is basically Congress told states that all of their state buildings had to be handicapped accessible. Again, that's a Commerce Clause thing. They told states, you've got to do this, you've got to pay for it. And then Gideon v. Wainwright is also an unfunded mandate, but this is not from Congress, but from the Supreme Court. States have to provide lawyers for poor defendants. And so that came out of the state budget. States had to find money to pay public defenders to represent people who did not have their own lawyer. So those are all examples of unfunded mandates from Congress or the Supreme Court to the states. Pause. Okay, in the 1990s, the Republican platform was called the Contract with America. And what they said to voters is, if you elect us to Congress, we promise you that we will give fewer unfunded mandates to the states because we're going to be a lot more state-friendly, and we're going to have what we call a devolution revolution. Devolution means when the national government voluntarily gives power to states. They don't have to, but they choose to. And so the Republicans said, we're going to do a devolution revolution, and they won. They took over Congress. So an example of what they did is welfare is when you lose your job for a short amount of time, the government will give you money so you can keep paying the bills. What Congress did is before this was a national program, After the devolution revolution, what the Republicans did is they made welfare a state program. The states decided who was eligible, how much they would be paid, and then, like Medicaid, they send a bill to the federal government at the end of the year. So that's more state friendly. Pause. Okay, the advantages of a federal system. First of all, there's a place for everybody. Vote with your feet. If you like a lot of environmental regulations and you're happy to pay high taxes for that, California is the place for you. If you don't, you probably want to move to Alabama. Everybody can find a place where they are happy. In Utah, there are a lot of Mormons there. There's a law that says there has to be a 15-foot wall between a bar and a kitchen or something like that as a way to cut down on restaurants selling alcohol. If that's for you, move to Utah. If it's not, live in New York. Because different states are allowed to do things differently in federalism, everybody can find a state that fits their style of life. States are laboratories of democracy, and a laboratory is where you do an experiment. And so each state can experiment with a different policy, and if one state tries something and it works, then other states will do it. And if a state tries something and it doesn't work, then we all realize it's a bad idea and we drop it. So instead of the whole country having to try something, one state can try it as kind of an experiment. Wyoming and a number of other states in the late 1800s, early 1900s gave women the right to vote long before the whole country did. And when Wyoming gave women the right to vote and it seemed to work and things didn't fall apart, other states started to do it, and then we adopted it as a national policy. Colorado has legalized marijuana. They're trying that policy out. And if it works, more and more states are going to do it. It's sort of an experiment. So a good thing about a federal system is because states can do things differently from each other, because they can make different choices, then one state can do sort of an experiment and see if it works. More power centers where people can get involved. If you want to be involved in government, you can do that at the national level or the state level or the city local level. And then lastly, one faction cannot dominate government. The Republicans have sort of the upper hand in national government right now. But because a lot of decisions are made at the state and local level, the Democrats are not out of luck. There are a lot of states that have a Democratic governor, like ours. There are a lot of states that have both a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature. And so, as the framers wanted, it's very, very difficult for one group to rule over everything in a federal system because there's just too many elections to win. So even if the national government is controlled by one faction, the other faction can still dominate in some states. Some disadvantages of a federal system. First of all, it's confusing. It's inefficient. It would be a lot more efficient if the national government could just come in and say, hey, here's the policy, everybody do it. But we have fights between the national and state government all the time. And when they disagree about a policy, it goes to the courts, and the courts have to make a decision, and that can be confusing and it can be inefficient. At the same time, it's what the framers wanted. They wanted us to argue. They wanted things to happen slowly with a lot of different people involved in kind of a pluralistic way. But it can be less efficient than a country like China, where the national government just says to all billion people, here's how it's going to be, and there's no complaining about it. Secondly, a local or state government can block a national majority, and sometimes that can be frustrating. If everybody in the country, a majority of people in the country are in favor of a policy, but one particular state or city isn't, then that can be very frustrating. So think, for example, about the video we saw where the national policy was integration, but the schools in Little Rock fought it, and we had to bring in the National Guard, etc. The last disadvantage that some people bring up is that states have different financial resources. And because of that, for example, education is funded by states or cities. Because the state of Connecticut has more money than the state of Louisiana, they're going to have more money for their schools. And most students in Connecticut are going to go to a better funded school than most kids in Louisiana. And even if you look at the city level, some cities in Connecticut have more money than others, and some cities in Connecticut are then going to be able to fund their schools more highly than others. And so some people would say this is a problem. Every kid in America ought to have the same quality schools, the same financing of schools, etc. But because we have a federal system where schools are financed by states and cities, it doesn't work that way. Okay, what's going to happen now is Caroline is going to argue her Mitchell v. Wisconsin case to you. She was arguing for Wisconsin. She is saying that the state was allowed to take Mitchell's blood without a warrant because he consented when he drove on the Wisconsin roads. So listen to her argument. If you have a question, interrupt her argument with a question and see how she does answering it. And then at the end, give her some feedback. Give her some feedback on what she did well, but also some feedback on where she could improve. And if you have a question, don't worry about, oh, well, this isn't a good question, it's a dumb question. Go ahead and ask it. But don't ask a silly question. If it's a question you really have and you'd like to hear her answer, go ahead and ask it by all means. But don't ask something silly, because she's working on making this argument better and she needs your help doing that. So we're going to do that, and then if there's time after that, Ms. Bugg's going to give you some practice AP exam questions.